Here's a question for you. What is your role supposed to be in a society that is increasingly hostile to your Christian beliefs? That is a question that has been on my mind quite a bit over the last few years, especially since 2020. And I know you've been thinking about it as well. It's now beyond question that American culture has moved beyond the point where being a Christian is seen as a social positive. Being a Christian is now viewed with suspicion or negatively, even as a social negative. So, as for you, you're a Christian man, you're trying to live a Christian life, but like me, you don't just want to live your life. The days of conservatives just wanting to be left alone and thinking that's actually going to happen, I'm afraid those days are most likely all but over. So now is the time to build up our families, to win back our institutions, and to impact the society and the culture in a way that brings glory to God and that prepares a better tomorrow for our children. Can you relate to this desire? Is this something that you've been thinking about as well? It's definitely something I've been thinking about. So, how do we do this? Well, to help me answer this question, Renn is returning to the podcast. Renn is the author of the book called Life in the Negative World. Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. This is a book that has really blessed me over the last several weeks. And in it, he describes how to function in the different domains of life in a way that can make the biggest impact now in the actual world that we live in. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of Worldview Legacy, you need to know about the Hammer and Anvil Society. This is our premier men's discipleship fellowship run by the Think Institute, where Christian men learn how to articulate, share, and defend the Christian message and build a legacy for their families where they and their wives and their kids will be able to confidently answer the world's questions from the Bible with confidence in a biblical way. I'm going to tell you more about the Hammer and Anvil Society after the episode. But that's what we're talking about today on the Worldview Legacy podcast. This is Worldview Legacy, the podcast from the Think Institute that helps Christian men become the worldview leaders their families and churches need. My name is Joel Sedekes. I am the executive director of the Think Institute. We are a Christian teaching and outreach nonprofit that helps equip Christian men to live in the negative world, essentially, to help you build your legacy so that you, your wife, and your kids can be able to confidently answer the world's questions right from the Bible. And I am beyond pleased to have Renn rejoining us again here on the podcast. So I'll bring him on. And Renn, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Renn, you wrote this book, and it's a good book. It's called Life in the Negative World. And it seems to be the culmination of a lot of the work that you've been doing ever since you made this pivot, first from being a managerial consultant, if I got that right, to then talking about men's issues, or to then doing city analysis, urban analysis, and then pivoting towards men's issues. And ever since you've been talking about men's issues, you seem to have really zeroed in on something that's resonated with a lot of people, which is the changing society and the changing attitude of the culture at large. For those who aren't really familiar with your three worlds hypothesis and framework, could you give us an introduction to positive, neutral, and negative world?
Sure. Well, this is, of all the stuff I've ever done in my life, this is probably the thing that has caught fire the most. I originally came up with the idea in 2014, and then I originally published it in my newsletter in 2017, and it actually went viral then. In fact, I was going to shut down my newsletter because I didn't have very many subscribers, and then I got 3,000 subscribers in a week after this piece went viral. And then First Things Magazine asked me to update it in February 2022 for an article that went really viral there, maybe the most cited article in the history of that magazine. And
Wow.
then I turned it into a book, which is now out. So it takes a long time for these ideas to germinate. But basically, the three worlds model is this. America never had a state church like they do in Europe, but a sort of generic Protestant Christianity was the de facto national religion of America for a long time. So, for example, you go back to the 1950s. About half of all Americans attended church every Sunday. That was actually the high watermark of church attendance in America.
Hmm.
We had prayer and Bible reading in the public schools. We added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in God we trust our money. And there's a famous photo that you may have seen shared on social media because people share it periodically. It's the skyline of New York with some of the skyscrapers with the lights in the windows lit up with crosses for Easter.
Hmm.
That picture was taken in 1956.
Okay.
And so that was sort of America up through the 1950s. Then in the 1960s, this sort of started to become unraveled as Christianity's status in society went into decline. And, decline in terms of church attendance, decline in terms of personal adherence, and decline in terms of the moral systems of Christianity beginning to get called into question. And I divide this period of decline from 1964 to the present, because alas, it's still ongoing, into three phases or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear, this is not a time in which all is going well for Christianity. This is a period of decline in Christianity. Church attendance is way down. People are worried about that. We're having the sexual revolution, Roe versus Wade, etc. And yet Christianity is still basically viewed positively by society. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. And Christian moral norms are still the moral norms of society, and violating them can get you into trouble. Then, in 1994, we hit a tipping point, and we entered what I called the neutral world, where Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a pluralistic public square. And this lasted from roughly 1994 to 2014. And again, we might meet each other, and I would say, I'm a Christian, and you would say, great, I'm a vegan. Let's sit down. Let's have a conversation.
Right.
Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point where, for the first time in the 400-year history of America, sort of official elite culture now views Christianity differently. It's true. I mean, even a lot of the founding fathers weren't necessarily the most devout Christians. They had maybe a lot of private reservations about Christianity, but certainly it was publicly held in honor. Now it is sort of publicly held in dishonor, certainly treated skeptically. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job with Goldman Sachs or Google. Quite the opposite, in fact. The Christian moral system is now expressly repudiated, and in fact, in some ways is seen as the new leading threat to the new public moral order. And this has really been a major dislocating experience as America entered this negative world. And I believe this is part of what underpins the sort of the evangelical crack up we've seen, in terms of, declines of attendance, intra-evangelical conflict, deconstruction, and people fleeing away from the term evangelical.
Yeah, that whole framework and that the way that you just laid that story out, I understand that there's always going to be outliers in any kind of a framework like that. You're not describing every locale in America, but it's so helpful to understand. And I meant to mention this to you before we got started, but your writing has been really beneficial to me. And actually, this is a total sidebar. So this is one of the I wouldn't have mentioned this, but I needed you to know the writing that you have done, not just on the negative world, but on masculinity and on attraction, has been so helpful. I had to tell you this because I'm happily married, so whatever I did to attract my wife, it worked. But our son, our oldest son, he's 12 years old, and I'm bringing him through a rite of passage to help him become a man.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote up a book for him, and there's a section in the book on dating and mating and that sort of thing, and sexual etiquette. and meaning a relationship between the sexes. And I have a section in there on what do girls find attractive, and I drew heavily from your newsletter
Oh, well,
and
thank you.
the research you've done there. So
Yeah, well, none of that is original insight to me. I mean, I'm just taking the stuff that kind of everybody knows and just writing it down. That's part of the problem with our society today is, common sense and things that everybody can see around them, with their own two eyes are sort of denigrated. No, that's not true. You can't believe that. No, no.
yeah,
And then they're telling you a bunch of nonsense. And so, you just saw the Super Bowl, right? So we have Taylor Swift. Who does she want to be with? She wants to be with this guy who's a superstar athlete.
right.
She doesn't want to be with the church janitor who is on fire for God. Okay.
Mhm.
And then, that's just reality. And so it's like we have to take account of that's how the world works. Now, we don't always have to respond the way the world says we should respond to things, but we need to understand how things actually work in the world.
Yeah.
And it's truly amazing, how few evangelical leaders will give anything remotely like an accurate description of how intersexual dynamics works.
And that explains the influence that I think you've been able to have. The last time we spoke, you described your work as something like being an influencer to the influencers, leaders who were looking for insights in their leadership. Is that still something that you see in the value that your work adds?
That's actually a term that I created to describe my work on cities, but I think it applies a lot to my work today too. That is to say, I'm not like a charismatic pastor up on stage that has a massive retail following. I've got a lot of people who read me, but a lot of the people who read me are pastors, they are theologians, they're journalists, they're college professors, they're elders in their churches. It's sort of other thought leaders who have influence on other people. And so definitely that's the class of people that I've had, more influence on. So people periodically send me clips of sermons where people are quoting my stuff in the pulpit. And it's like, wow, it's kind of mind blowing, but also as a weight of responsibility. When you only have a few hundred followers and not many people in your mailing list, you can afford to kind of mouth off a little bit, just, whatever. It's like the more exposure that you have and the more that people are actually acting on what you're saying, the more serious you have to take, right, what you are doing. And you have to be really, really diligent in what you say because people are repeating it and acting on it. But what I would say is much more so than in sort of the urban space, I do have as well a retail following of men, who just ordinary men going about their lives, and women. I've actually have a relatively diverse, believe it or not, kind of a diverse readership, listenership, and so I'm more of a retail leader, but I'm still not. I'm still much more of a reaching other thought leaders, you might say.
Okay. And when you say retail leader, you mean like sort of the direct to consumer type?
Yeah. So again, I think of again a pastor of a megachurch who's directly reaching thousands of people every Sunday, ordinary people who attend his church, or somebody like Jordan Peterson, who,
Sure.
millions of young men are looking to Jordan Peterson to be their guide in life.
Mm.
Believe it or not, there are some people who actually look to me for guidance. And that's a huge weight of responsibility, but mostly it is the pastors who are then going to pastor their flock, who are using my work to help inform, what they're doing. And that's part of how I see it. I don't like to be the guru. And, the way that you become a guru, one of the things is you speak with great certainty about a formula that will work in your life.
Uh-huh.
And, there is no formula like that. And I don't like to give people direct advice, but I like to equip them with tools and frameworks and ideas that they can use to make their own choices in their own circumstances.
Well, that is definitely what you do in this book, Life in the Negative World. You lay out tools for people to use, and you lay out, I thought it was organized really helpfully, how you talk about the different domains. Before we jump into the 3 different domains that you lay out, though, I wanted to talk with you about, just briefly, about positive and neutral world strategies, because there's an element of your book, Aaron, that confused me. And that is, on the one hand, you talk about how positive and neutral world strategies did not stop the decline from happening. You can go back to the 1950s and 60s, and you can see the slide from the apex of Christian influence in the 50s down into down. Positive world is a state of decline, but then you've got neutral world, which is a continuing decline, and now in negative world, the decline continues. So you talk about how positive and neutral world strategies ultimately did not stem that tide or stop that decline. And yet you also note something else early on in the book, and that is that these strategies must have done something, because we're not in the same kind of state that Europe is today, being here in the United States. So before we start talking about negative world, how effective have positive and neutral world strategies been?
Well, evangelicalism, in a sense, is a product of the period of decline of Christianity in America. Back in the 1950s, it was really the mainline denominations that sort of dominated the religious life of America. The mainline denominations went into decline, and they were never really able to figure out how to reverse that, and they're still going down. Whereas evangelicalism proved to have superior adaptability to changing time and sort of grew rapidly in that era. Now, again, that didn't stave off the decline in society, but it did keep a lot of people in the church. And I think the fact that evangelicalism has been so adaptable is one of its strengths, and really, I think gives the most optimism for thinking that, we'll figure it out again in the negative world. But I really highlight three different strategies that the evangelicals took on during this period of decline. Two of them were in the positive world and one in the neutral world. In the positive world, we had the culture war strategy and the seeker sensitivity strategy. And in the neutral world, we had the cultural engagement strategy. So the culture war is the religious right that we all know. They saw that things were not going the right way in society from their perspective, sexual revolution, etc. And their answer was to mobilize politically to fight back. We're going to take back the country, and we're going to push back this sort of rising tide of godlessness and liberalism. You could think about people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, as kind of like seminal figures. There, of course, the religious right's still with us today. I would say a lot of the hardcore Trump evangelicals definitely fall into this category. And I think it's interesting, the very name of the leading organization of that era, Moral Majority, speaks to the fact that we were in the positive world. It's like you would never claim that today. A second strand was seeker sensitivity, also emerging in the 1970s, pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago and Rick Warren at Saddleback Church. And this group of people basically saw Christianity in decline as well, but their response was essentially to design a church that people would want to attend. So the origin story of Willow Creek is that Bill Hybels went door to door in suburban Chicago asking people why they didn't go to church. And as he said, they gave me an earful. And so he's like, well, I'm going to design a church for these people. We're going to get rid of these denominational distinctives, fancy liturgies, choir robes and hymns. It's going to be informal. It's going to be contemporary music. It's going to be topical therapeutic sermons. And it was enormously successful. This is essentially the progenitor of the non-denominational suburban megachurch that we all know, that in many ways is the evangelical mainstream. And then in the neutral world of the 1990s, a third strategy emerged called cultural engagement, pioneered by people like Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. I think there are a couple ways to think about this. The first is as a seeker sensitivity for the cities. This was the era when cities were coming back under people like Mayor Rudy Giuliani in New York, and this new urban progressive demographic, these people spoke to them in the way that Hybels and Rick Warren spoke to emerging baby boomer suburbia. A second way to think of it is as the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with the culture all the time, they're like, why don't we have a conversation with people? Let's take advantage of this kind of multicultural public square in order to be able to articulate the gospel in a new way that will hopefully win some converts. And again, it was very successful and is very much with us today. You can think of the urban and college town church very much falling into this category. So all these things are still with us. As we transition to the negative world, you ask, well, what's the strategy for the negative world? And the reality is that no strategy has yet emerged. The only one that's really been proposed is Rod Dreher's Benedict option. And, Rod basically, he basically the evangelicals rejected him. They didn't like what he had to say. And there were maybe some reasons for that around too much Catholic monastic imagery and things. But at the end of the day, I think there was also a great sense of denial. I think there's less denial today, but I think people are still grappling for what to do. And so rather than adapt to the negative world, we've sort of seen a doubling down on what people were doing before, combined with a sort of deformation of the existing policies or strategies.
Have you heard of Andrew Isker and his Boniface option?
I have. Yeah.
Okay, so I had him on the show several months ago, and we talked about his book, and he's almost presented as kind of an anti-Benedict option in a way, not totally opposed to the mentality of what Rod Dreher is talking about, but I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts on that strategy. His strategy has to do with essentially fighting back rather than retreating, trying to build parallel institutions and then use those parallel institutions to take over the existing institutions. Did you have any thoughts on that? I don't want to get too far afield, but I was just curious.
I did not read his actual book as of yet. So the actual details there, I know he's heavily influenced by Doug Wilson in the sort of that sort of post-millennial mindset. I would probably describe that as pretty much in line with how culture war people have been thinking about the shift to the negative world. The idea being that we need to take the gloves off a little bit and maybe adopt a more revolutionary posture. And again, if you go back, I mean, this is sort of what the original culture war people were saying too. I do think we have to remember, like, the culture war emerged out of something called the New Right movement in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And you may have said, well, I've been hearing about this New Right today, and that's because there's nothing older than the New Right. And if you listen to people, like Richard Viguerie, who were one of the progenitors of the New Right, they say things like, what you have to understand about us is we don't want to conserve anything. We want to overthrow the regime or something like that. He didn't quite phrase it exactly like that, but that was basically like, we're taking a more revolutionary posture. And so I think that is more his approach. I do think, one of the things that is, I think, very much the case that's true out of that style of approach is this, namely that if you don't have something of an edge when it comes to clearly demarcating your community versus the world, you definitely will get swallowed up. And so I think there is a sense in which I'm on record. I just wrote like a big, huge newsletter. I need to have a positive vision more than a negative vision.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Things that we really have to be laying out, like positive visions for our own community and how we ought to be living. At the same time, we do have to be able to look at the world and say, this is not us. We are not doing these things. And so if you don't have something of that edge, then you are going to get devoured by the culture.
Yeah. And unfortunately, you see that quite a bit. And in your book, you talk about these 3 different domains. You say, let's see, here's a quote from page 49. You say, I've identified a set of 3 starter ideas across each of the 3 key domains of our evangelical life: personal, institutional, and missional, end quote. Before we get into those domains, this sounds a little bit like Abraham Kuyper's sphere sovereignty. Like I'm hearing some echoes of it, maybe, the household, the church, the civil sphere. Is that similar, or is there something else going on here?
No, that's not really what I was thinking. I think I'm not really influenced by Kuyper at all.
Okay.
I've only read one slim book of his. I just thought, like, look, these are just the ways we have to think about things. The first was we have to think about how do we live as individuals and as families. We got to think about what should our churches and ministries and maybe our businesses and other institutions do. And then missionally is how do we engage the world around us? Politics is part of that, but it's not necessarily the civil government. I'm thinking a lot about Great Commission and, reaching the lost and discipleship and things of that nature. And one reason, just a little maybe inside baseball here is, one reason I included a whole section on mission is, I got the advantage of seeing the reaction to Rod Dreher's book. And a lot of people took away from his book, I think incorrectly took away from it, but what they took away from it is that he's saying head for the hills, run and hide in your bunker, go close the door of your monastery and survive the flood, building an ark. Well, I do think he's probably built an ark. He wouldn't necessarily completely dispute that analogy. But so I want to say is, look, I'm going to keep mission up in bright lights. There is an external mission to the church that we don't want to lose track of. And so I wanted to put that up in bright lights so nobody could accuse me of saying to go to your North Idaho bunker or something like that.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, no, that is helpful. So then let's get into these domains. So the first one you talk about is the personal domain. And you speak quite a bit about anti-fragility, the idea that you can be resilient in the face of negative events and even actually benefit from negative events. And is it Nassim Taleb?
Yes. I'm not sure quite how you pronounce it. He's Lebanese. I'm sure, I'm going to my men's Bible study tonight, and the leader of that is Lebanese. And so I should ask him how to pronounce it. Because I'm sure they would pronounce it differently. I pronounce it Nassim Taleb.
Okay. That's how I normally...
I think it might be Taleb. I'm not quite sure. But he was very famous for writing a book called The Black Swan that seemed to predict the financial crash in 2007. I think the book sold 3 million copies. I actually don't think that's his best book that you should read today. But he wrote 2 great books that I think I would put on people's list. One is called Fooled by Randomness, and the other was Anti-Fragile. And he talks about, look, these events seem to come out of the blue and hit us, and they put us under stress, and like a storm puts a house under stress. And so we, how do we respond to that stress? We could be fragile, like maybe a piece of crystal that if we're subjected to stress will shatter. We could be resilient, like the hull of an airplane or something like that, that when the storm hits, the airplane gets buffeted around, but it's still intact. Unless they forget to bolt in the door plug or something like that at Boeing HQ. But he comes up with this third category of anti-fragility, which is you actually get stronger when you're subjected to these sorts of stress. And of course, human body is somewhat like that. Exercise makes us stronger, and obviously we could be overstressed and be killed, but it's actually unhealthy to not be stressed. And so there's a lot there, but this idea of thinking about how do we make our lives, structure our lives to be more resilient, if not anti-fragile, at least resilient, in the face of potential opposition from the world.
And you mentioned
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm basically done there.
Well, what you mentioned that marriage is a resiliency booster. It's a resilience booster. I just read a report recently that was talking about how, or maybe I saw the headline, maybe that was what it was. It said that married people tend to be happier. It was like a 15-year study. Married people are happier. I think a lot of us who are married kind of knew that instinctively. But what's going on there? How is marriage a resilience booster?
Well, it's, I don't think marriage is a panacea by any means. But, if you're married and one person loses their job, the other person can pick up the slack. You've got sort of division of labor. You've got people to take care of you when you're sick. You've got, you've got people to, it's why poverty and single motherhood are so highly correlated. It's like when there aren't 2 people around to make money to take care of the kids, it becomes quite stressful. You've got that emotional companionship. Now, of course, the divorce risk is also quite high. The divorce rate's been declining in America, but it's still quite high. But the truth is, from a statistical perspective, it is possible to marry someone with whom you have a relatively low risk of divorce,
Mhm.
And so this is where, the information that you're not going to get, from the church, but there's a lot of things that would correlate with whether you're going to be divorced. So one of the things to ask is are your prospective spouse's parents married? If they're not, if your prospective spouse's parents are not married, that increases divorce risk. If they are, it reduces it.
Hmm.
It's not popular to say, but the truth is, they're statistically go to the Institute for Family Studies, which pop by PhD academics publishing there, and you'll see that your sexual partner count affects your likelihood of divorce.
Hmm.
People who've only ever had sex with their spouse are at much lower risk of divorce than someone who marries someone who's been promiscuous. And
Right.
so that's just reality. And so, there's a lot of these statistical correlates you could go through. And, so, you got to be careful. It's like we got to be diligent. So I'm not going to say that like marriage is a panacea. Marriage can be bad. There's there's no guarantees in life. That's
Yeah.
reality. I think that marriage with children is the normative path for humanity. I'm not saying everyone should do that. It's a free country. You can do whatever you want. There's definitely huge risks as well. I'm not going to lie about that. But at the same time, the reality is it's sort of like the passage in the Bible. The strand of three cords is not easily broken, right? And that's like the
Yeah.
point is like when you have multiple people all pulling together on the same team, it's great. If you read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, you would know that the division of labor is the bedrock of enhanced productivity. And so when you have two people, you can divide up the labor and you can each
Right.
specialize in certain things and get those gains, and it's like there are a lot of financial gains potentially, things of that nature. And so there are a lot of reasons to think that marriage is good. Brad Wilcox has a new book coming out tomorrow called Get Married. He's a sociologist at University of Virginia. He's with the Institute for Family Studies as well. And he's got so many stats in there about what's good about being married.
Is he a believer?
Yes, he's a very devout Catholic.
Okay.
Although all of his, he's a sociologist. So when he's arguing in the public square, he's arguing as a sociologist. He's not giving Catholic theology, but he is a man of faith.
Okay.
He has his own product. He's got a whole bunch of kids too. So he's buying his own product. Let me put it that way.
I like that. So speaking of marriage, you say something in the book that initially rubbed me the wrong way, and I'm still not sure what I think of it, but you talk about the neo-patriarchy movement.
Yeah.
And what you call it at one point, little more than play acting. Why is that? What's going on there?
Well, for one thing, we don't live in a patriarchy. Patriarchy is an actual legal and social system in which the patria, right, the father, actually has real legal authority, right, in the home. The Roman pater familias literally ruled over his household, and the entire Roman legal system backed him up in that. Well, that's not true today. The reality is with no-fault divorce and all these other things and a vast array of sort of feminist programs, many of which are written into law, if anything, our society is deeply hostile to husbands and fathers. And you hold no legal authority, and patriarchy is, in fact, officially treated as an evil in our society. You're not going to see any collection of anyone in any position of authority in our society publicly advocate for patriarchy. So far from actually being the system of our country, we're in a very legally and culturally egalitarian society in which patriarchy is officially denigrated. Ergo, you can call yourself a patriarch, but the minute your trad wife doesn't want to go along with it anymore, it's going to get real. And so that's what's going on. The other thing is, there's a lot. There's like the whole idea of the inevitability of patriarchy. And it is true that, men have dominated the top ranks of societies and still do. I mean, we still have men predominate at the absolute top echelons of our society, even though, maybe at the sort of middle management and upper middle management level, women are actually outpacing men on virtually every matter. Nevertheless, the top entrepreneurs, top politicians, et cetera, tend to be men. But you go to those societies and, sure, you could say it's a patriarchy, but what you have in a lot of those societies throughout history is there's like one guy or a handful of guys at the top that have all the money, all the women in their harems. It's polygamous. Most men literally end up nothing. They're like that. So that's not a system that's not a patriarchy that would benefit you in any way. Now, where I do think there's things that are true is one that women want to marry up typically. They certainly don't want to marry down at any rate. So they tend to marry men who are of higher socioeconomic status. They make more money. They're taller. They're a little bit older. All the things we see on average. And so there is a sense that in that situation, an individual woman might look to her husband or boyfriend to somewhat lead just because she feels like, I did marry up. That's what she wanted. Now, that's not true of everybody. But I think there are things there. And there is still essentially a cultural expectation, that men are going to initiate in asking women out, that men are going to pay for dates, things of that nature. Now, again, the Gen Z guys on here might, give me a hard time about saying that, but there are certain cultural expectations that are still somewhat traditional. But, by and large, I mean, the most important point is we just don't live in a patriarchy. And again, talking about patriarchy, I think patriarchy is useful in certain respects. If you're talking about patriarchy, you are probably very readily identifying other people who are like-minded on gender than you. So it's a Schelling point, if you're familiar with what a Schelling point is.
What is that? Can you explain?
Well, it's like in game theory, it's called a Schelling point or a focal point. And the idea is it's a point that enables spontaneous sort of coordination. So I think the original idea was, imagine you had to meet someone at noon in New York City, but you don't know where you're supposed to meet them. Where would you go? And, this guy said, well, the most likely place is the clock in Grand Central Terminal. And so maybe you wouldn't pick there, but you're probably going to pick a very prominent place. If I were going to meet somebody, meet me in Indianapolis at noon on this date.
In the circle.
On the circle. Right?
Yeah.
You're gonna go somewhere. There's a certain place you're gonna go, and so there's certain things that allow you to coordinate action and recognize people that are there. So without kind of a formal control systems, and so I think that patriarchy. When you talk about patriarchy, you're sort of identifying your tribe through that lingo, and that's very valuable, I think, as well. And it also, it kind of signals that you've rejected certain ideologies, that themselves are problematic. And so I'm not a hater on people who say that. I just think, we have to be real. That's where I was actually on a talk show with Doug Wilson called Man Rampant.
I saw that.
2018 or something like that. And he was asking me, well, people talk about servant leadership, but what about servant lordship or servant rulership or things of that nature? And, I think we got to realize too, the reality is, no, I'm not the lord of my home, right? I'm not the ruler, right, of my home. I think the idea of a servant leader, although I've written entire things criticizing the servant leader concept, the idea of leadership does get at something important, which is in our society today, men have to operate in an influence model. They can't command. They have to have emotional intelligence, and they have to be able to influence and, navigate interpersonally these relationships with their wives and children, which a lot of guys, frankly, aren't that good at. And so, that's a part of, but it can be, but it's also learnable. That's the thing. It's like, there are all these sorts of social scripts that try to portray women as mysterious creatures who could never be understood, and that therefore you could never even attempt to kind of master that kind of emotional intelligence, when in fact you can actually learn, just like you can learn how to do a lot of things that you don't think you can do. You can
Uh-huh.
learn how to draw,
Right.
you can learn the basics of selling, you can learn how to interact with people, kind of thing.
Well, that's encouraging. You know, what I hear you saying, Aaron, and I don't want to belabor the point of patriarchy too much, but it was something that stuck out to me in your book, in particularly because we've through the Think Institute, we have a men's discipleship fellowship. And one of the topics that we talk about is patriarchy, where I will go back and look at the life of Abraham as a model. And Abraham was obviously operating under a true patriarchal system, which we don't have today anymore. Um, but what I hear you, okay, so the way I'll present it is there are different elements of lessons that we can learn from Abraham's life as kind of an archetypical patriarch. He exercised authority and assumed that, took on that mantle. He discipled his family. He led them spiritually. He built a legacy, viewed himself and his household as part of God's plan. And so, what I try to encourage men with is the idea of assuming the responsibility to lead in that way, even under the assumption and the understanding that we don't live in that kind of legal framework anymore. So while you can try to pursue a godly, fatherly leadership in the style of Abraham, yeah, you're gonna face difficulties that maybe he didn't face, and it's not going to look the way he did. Do you think there's anything to that, like trying to pursue a sort of patriarchal mentality as opposed to certainly as opposed to an egalitarian mindset, but then even trying to avoid complementarianism, which I think in your book you say makes masculinity all about women anyway. So,
Yeah.
what other alternative is there?
Part of that is, not mistaking kind of your mission in life and where you're going with just being, essentially a servant to your wife and children. This is one of the things that kind of servant leadership gets wrong. Kind of the servant leadership as portrayed makes the mission of a man in the world a little
Right,
more than catering to the needs, wants, and desires of his wife and children.
right,
And in fact, um, that's actually not what women want. Men want a man who's going somewhere in life, who's achieving things. Jordan Peterson says in 12 Rules for Life, girls are attracted to boys who win status competitions with other boys.
yeah,
And that's the reality, right? That's why somebody, wants to be with the guy who just won the Super Bowl.
hmm
And so there's part of it. If you don't seem like you've got anything going on in life, if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a mission, if you're not going somewhere, then no woman is likely to be that interested. And also, if you actually have an idea of where you're going, that helps you in thinking about who you want to marry, because you want to have someone who wants to come on that mission with you and wants to be a part of what you're doing. Whereas if you don't have any idea what you're about, that's a problem. And so, if you don't have an idea of, where you're going in life and in a sense of what you want to create, how are you expanding the kingdom into the world?
yeah.
How are you planning to do these things? Then it's not going to really be your wife's not going to be that happy, right? Just because you
Yeah.
help out with the dishes or something like that, it's gonna.
Right.
Not that she's
Right.
not that she doesn't want help with that stuff,
Yeah.
sometimes she doesn't want you to not do anything, but at the same time, it's like, nobody wants to be married to a loser,
Yeah.
and so you gotta have something going on, and so you got to be developing yourself, you got to have a mission, and you got to be out there, hitting it every day.
So this talk about building and having a mission, it reminds me of what you talked about in terms of the institutional domain, building institutions and that sort of thing. And one question that keeps coming back up for me, Aaron, is as we slid from positive world to neutral world and now into negative world, one thing that we see, at least it looks like this to me, is we've seen the left and those who are hostile to Christianity taking over institutions. Even thinking about Harvard right now, and the ideological, I want to say ideological drift, but it's really more ideological capture of a lot of these institutions. So my question is, how did we lose these institutions, or did we ever have them in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. You could, yeah, you'd have to look at it on kind of a case by case basis. Um, but it's kind of it's one of conquest laws. I think it is any organization that is not explicitly right wing sooner or later becomes left wing.
Right.
There is a sort of drift, I think, in those directions, and institutions are heavily pulled by overall cultural currents. Why did every business adopt DEI? Because the culture adopted DEI. And so it's very, very difficult for an institution to not go along with the culture. The mainstream media plays an enormous role in what institutions do because institutions, most of them simply cannot handle bad press. So if the New York Times and the Washington Post and them call you bad names, typically they crumble. That's reality. And, the average person, is somebody who just goes along to get along. They are trying to figure out how to get ahead in life, and therefore they adopt the ideas that are high status in society.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's cynical. I think there's a lot of conservatives who have this idea that, like, all of these people are totally cynical about this stuff. They're not cynical about it. They believe it. I mean, they're like, I think they honestly believe it because we always tend to rationalize beliefs that we think are in our interest or will make us high status or things of that nature. That's just the nature of the beast. And so there's a whole lot of things that go to that role. The other thing is like, if you listen, if you listen to like conservatives talk about things, and there's many people who've, I'm not giving you any like unique to me insights here. It's like conservatives tend to focus on the mission, less about the organization. So what do conservatives talk about in terms of foreign policy? They talk
I think
about
I've heard you talk about this on your podcast
what
before.
do we need to be doing? Oh, we need to be supporting Ukraine here. We need Taiwan there. It's all about the policies. It's all about the weapon system. It's all about that. They're not thinking about, okay, who runs the military bureaucracy? Like that's not even a concern of theirs.
Right.
For the most part, that sort of thing doesn't compute. Where sort of the left is very socialized to think that going to work for some activist NGO is like a really great thing to do. And so, I think there's a bifurcation there. And, fundamentally, there's also the fact that, people on the left are just fundamentally dishonest people. I mean, that's just a reality is that, willingness to lie in various forms of dishonesty and prevarication and, manipulation is just endemic to that. Whereas I think, especially people who are Christians, they this integrity that you have. So well, I can't engage in any subterfuge. That would be unethical, something like that. And so I feel like it's, you're a little, you're kind of in a Machiavellian situation where you're, particularly if you don't recognize that other people are not necessarily all telling you the truth. That's something you got to like, you're there.
So should we be seeking as evangelical Christians to aspire to elite positions where we can maximize our influence in society today? Or should we be pursuing what Rory Groves calls the durable trades, those time-tested, means of employment? Where should we be focusing our attention right now?
Well, one thing I would say is, if you're someone who is of high moral character, if you're highly confident in what you do, and, you have great motives and intentions, then absolutely you should want to be of high influence in society because you're exactly the sort of person who's going to use that potential influence well, And, I think this is one of the things that like Jordan Peterson, the way he talks about things, I see how it appeals to so many young men. He says things. He just actually, he's sort of taken a turn that I don't think is too positive. He's a little angrier and all that.
Yeah,
But,
I've
he
seen
just
that.
tweeted something that was kind of like old school Jordan Peterson, where he said, you're morally obligated to try to achieve great things. And then he
Ooh,
goes through his kind of rationale of why that is. And so I think, it just sounds bad to say, though, I want to achieve something great. And yeah, I mean,
why does that
absolutely.
sound bad? Why?
Yeah, I
What?
mean, like, so I think that, ultimately, right, I'm committed to trying to be fair, accurate, impartial, to be the kind of leader that we want to have in the world. And so, therefore, why would I not want to have the most influence I can possibly have? Of course, I want to have a lot of influence.
Hmm.
And, because I'm working hard to be a good influence. Now, sometimes be careful what you wish for. On the other hand, I think going into places that just have the highest pay, the highest status in society, may not be the wisest move. Depending on you, your conscience, your financial situation, your family background, a whole host of things, that might not be a healthy place to go in. And so I think that we need to really think intentionally, for example, about where we live, what kind of career we go into, et cetera. And, we want to avoid the traditional path to how people think you become elite in America. Because one, you don't actually have a lot of influence. You're
Hmm.
really just one more cog in a wheel. You're not like a man behind a curtain really pulling any strings.
You mean even in those elite positions?
Yeah. I mean, you could be like, if you're a partner at McKinsey, how much influence do you really have in the world?
Hmm.
Maybe you can advise companies to lay a bunch of people off or something
What
like
is
that.
McKinsey?
McKinsey's a major consulting company.
Okay.
But let's just say I'm a partner at Goldman Sachs. I make a lot of money. I'm helping, the finance world make the world go around. But am I really like influencing the world for Christ in any way
Hmm.
if I'm in that organization? And so I think that a lot of times, you don't really have a lot of power. The minute you start rocking the boat on something, you could easily find yourself out, which is why so many of our leaders are just kind of like, they're such self-evidently cowards. They never stick their neck out on anything that could get them in trouble. What they do is they denounce Donald Trump and then all pat each other on the back about how brave they are. Right. But, you don't hear them coming out and
Stunning
saying,
and brave.
hey, DEI has gone a little too far. You don't hear
Uh-huh.
them typically say that. This one guy, Bill Ackman, the hedge fund guy who's been taking on Harvard, they're now writing hit jobs on him in like the Washington Post and these different papers because he's like stirring the pot. Of course, he's a billionaire. And that's the thing. Like, if you're a billionaire, then you can have an influence.
Like an Elon Musk.
Yeah, you have the potential. It doesn't mean you will, but you have the potential. But like most people aren't going to get to like billionaire level. So most of the time we got to think about where actually can we have the most influence in society. Most likely, I'm having the most influence that I can think of by doing what I'm doing, and it's, I'm successful at what I'm doing, but nor I'm not a New York Times columnist either, or something like that, and I probably never
Yeah.
will be. But in my position, I have the ability to put out information that really helps a lot of people in the church think about their ministries, their missions, their lives in positive ways. So I'm able to have a real impact on people's lives where I'm at, even though there may be more conventional ways that I could make more money. If I, undoubtedly, my biggest mistake in life by a traditional measure would be leaving the consulting world to go into public policy. I'd have a lot more money today if I'd stayed in technology consulting, but
Yeah.
but I wouldn't be having any influence on the world. So I think we can conflate sort of financial and status success with the ability to have influence and power, and James Davison Hunter, his book To Change the World sort of legitimized the pursuit of elite status by Christians by talking about how that's where the sausage is made. That's where the culture changes. That's true. But, he also says culture changes in networks. It changes at the center. And you're just like one more node in the network. And, you know, I haven't actually seen a lot of Christians who get to that level who are really willing to, you know, rock the boat and leverage all of the power that they have to make alterations in the network. And so I think
Okay.
that's where kind of the rubber meets the
Interesting.
road. So by all means, you know, by all means, let's seek to have influence. Um, you know, but you know, maybe they're, you know, and that's not everybody. Maybe your character is bad, and we need to first work on your character. You need to first
Yeah.
work on gaining some skills. You know, you gotta like make sure you're the person who's, you know, we gotta walk in a manner worthy of what you aspire to be entrusted with. Be
Well,
faithful in what you
yeah.
have, and then you'll be entrusted with more. So those sorts of things. But in general,
Good.
if you're doing the right things, you should want to be in charge, right?
Right.
If you're the, you know, because wouldn't you be the best person to be in charge?
Right.
Now, I would say I don't particularly want to be in charge of something because I'm probably not the best CEO, right? I mean,
Mm.
my skill set does not lend itself as much to being a CEO. I mean, I've managed multi-million-dollar projects and stuff, so like some of that stuff I can do, but I don't enjoy it as much, and it's not my highest wins above replacement, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I want to be focused. I want to be focused where I can make the impact. And for a lot of people, you know, some of their greatest impacts in the world are going to be the way that they raised their children, the way that they were a presence in their neighborhood. Not everything has to be at the highest level. You can have impact at some scale. It's not always going to be
Yeah.
at the same scale. Um, and so we shouldn't denigrate, you know, what seem to be unglamorous roles in terms of influence. Every man can have influence for the better in this world.
That is what I wanted to get to, and what I wanted to ask you is for our listener who is probably in more of a blue collar employment, whether a contractor, a fireman, or is in white collar, maybe in the sales world, that sort of thing, but most likely not in elite status, you know, not an executive at Goldman Sachs,
Right.
McKinsey, that sort of thing. You know, what sort of influence should they be pursuing? And maybe it is coaching your kids' football team, because that's a way of having influence in your immediate sphere. It's a way of positively impacting the lives and reaching the lives of children, but also the families that are there, and then being open to opportunities to have more impact. I mean, what do you think about that? Is it sort of figure out the level that God has placed you in and try to maximize that, or what do you think?
I think there's huge opportunities if you're in those spaces. Like if you're in a, you know, a blue collar type you know, employment, you know, how you actually like do your job, delivering high quality work at a fair price, you know,
Mm,
being the ethical businessman that can be trusted, being the person who's delivering quality products. Think about the people who are manufacturing that Boeing plane. They were not thinking the right way.
right.
You know, they almost had a very bad influence for the worse, could have killed a bunch of people. And
Mm,
so this is really where the rubber hits the road. And sometimes it could get these positions often put you sometimes in ethical dilemmas that are hard for people because like, hey, if I'm a partner at Goldman and whatever, and like I don't like something that the boss is doing, I'll quit. I got some money saved up, you know, that a lot of people don't have that. And I was talking with this young woman in her early 20s who was working in a dentist office, and you know, uh, she's kind of convinced this guy might be a little shady in terms of doing unneeded procedures, and that
mm.
you know, some of his billing practices may not be quite up to snuff. And she's like, "Well, I'm trying to get out, but what should I do?" I'm like, "That's an interesting one." And I said, "One thing I say is, you, and this is true, you can never be involved in unethical billing ever." That'll
Right.
hang up your head. You just can't do it. If somebody is committing fraudulent billing, you can never become complicit in that.
Right.
If a dentist, I mean, this is like a real life kind of a situation. It's like, so it's
Mm,
like, hey, if this guy's a dentist who's doing unneeded procedures, that's on him as the licensed professional. They're not going to come after you because you didn't stop this guy from doing procedures that may not have been medically necessary because you're not a medical professional.
Hmm.
But if you knowingly submit false insurance claims, you're putting yourself in criminal jeopardy.
Yeah.
And it's like you can't do that. And so just like so it's a part of, sometimes it's just like being able to hold that line
Mm.
is is possible. Sometimes you could get fired or whatever. A lot of times people who know they're doing shady stuff, if you just make it clear you're not going to go along with them, they're like, okay. They typically back off. I say they typically do back off because
Mm.
they know they're doing something shady, and so. But those are like, that's where it is. I mean, there's a lot of highly unethical behavior
Yeah.
in sort of home contracting and other things, and so there are people who are really put into ethical dilemma situations. But just like the reality is, like being really good at what you do, good customer service, again, helping your neighbors, there's lots of opportunities there to do something that is positive, I think, in the world. And that doesn't mean you need to be a chump, for an exploitative boss or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, it's the sort of thing that, where, you get faced with like real life. Okay, am I going to live out my values in practice?
Yeah. Yeah. And that, the last thing I wanted to ask you about had to do with, I think it dovetails very nicely with what you're talking about. And that is the pursuit of excellence. When we think about building institutions, when we think about pursuing our mission, I come out of the church world. I'm a former pastor, and it was something that I wrestled with all the time, Aaron, is what level of production do we need to have on a Sunday morning? And we would actually run through our church services once all the way through before anybody came to actually worship. And that was not my decision. And I was actually against it at first because I felt like it was too overproduced. But it was a decision that was made at a level higher than me in this multi-site church. But then once we started doing it, I realized I was catching a lot of mistakes that I would have otherwise made. And it made I hate to use the term worship experience, but it made the worship service that much smoother and that much more excellent. And, I came around to viewing it as this is something that we are presenting to the Lord, and we ought not to put any obstacles in anyone's way when they're coming to worship the Lord. I wonder if you might speak to, for Christians who are involved in church work or who are seeking to lead in ministry in some way, what does pursuing excellence look like in your opinion? And maybe what's a practical step we can take to pursue that?
Well, one thing I do think that evangelicals are world class at some things. They're world class at public speaking. I mean, the
Mm.
top evangelical preachers are truly astonishingly good and extremely good at church productions, too. I mean, a lot of the stuff is incredibly slick there. On the other hand, I was really inspired by a very famous book. It was written about 30 years ago by a historian named Mark Knoll. It's called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind.
Mm.
The idea being that evangelicals don't seem to have a mind and that there's really no intellectual life in the evangelical church. And, so I'm like, and that's true. I mean, the reality is it's, not the intellectual like forefront of America. But I also just think about, many other areas where we don't have sort of leadership. I mean, there's so many people online who are sort of health and fitness influencers. I don't know many of them who are actual Christians,
Mhm.
and so um, that's an area where first you need to have the expertise in kind
Yeah.
of the domain, but then how you present it within like a Christian framework. It doesn't have to be an explicitly Christian thing. You don't ever have to mention Jesus, but everything that you're doing is part of like a healthy, godly way of approaching it. And so I think there's a lot of areas where essentially all of the direction and leadership in society has been setting by people who are not Christian because we don't have anything in it. The second area of around excellence is this idea that, the degree of difficulty dial on life is just a lot harder than it used to be. It's harder than ever to achieve a middle class standard of living, to have a stable, profession and career. And you know, it's even harder than ever to like get into a good college. You know, there was
Mm.
this scandal called Varsity Blues. It's got a lot of things where
Yeah. What was
these
that?
it was out in California. It was these some of these people were like actresses and actors in movies, and like these people had
Yeah.
these were millionaire people who
That
hired
was
this
Aunt Becky from Full House. Was that the one that
something
she?
like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
I don't know exactly what it was, but like they hired this consultant to get their kids into different schools, and so he sort of faked getting them like a lacrosse scholarship or something,
Oh
and
yeah,
so people
right.
went to jail over it. And so, you know, the thing is, it's just so much harder to get married today,
Mm.
and you know, it's harder to stay married. It's hard to raise kids in the faith. You know, my grandparents, who were greatest generation, they got married, and I'm sure they had fights, and I'm sure there was all kinds of things that went on. I don't think either of them ever once worried in their life that, you know, their spouse was going to divorce them. I
Mm.
mean, that is a remarkable degree of security
Yeah.
that you have. And so, you know, the degree of difficulty dials up on life. So again, when you talk about, like I talked about earlier about this leadership, if you're a guy, this idea that you're just some, well, I guess I just gonna, you know, watch the NFL and grill my burgers and go on my fishing trips, and you know, you have to have like a high degree of intentionality about
Mm.
your marriage, about everything that you do. You know, maybe especially if you're not in that cognitive, you know, financial elite of the country, um, because the risk to you are much higher. I think in many ways, and so you know, the reality is there's an economist named Tyler Cowen. He's famous for writing at this site called Marginal Revolution. He's kind of a public intellectual. His book was called "Average is Over,"
Mm.
and you know that's the reality. You know, the world is increasingly getting divided into winners and losers, and we have to fight hard in our lives to make sure that we're the winner side of the divide, and it means, you know, we have to be bringing it, and that's quite apart, even from you know, from being a Christian. But
Yeah.
if you're an evangelical, you know, evangelicalism has really not been the the Christianity of the elites. That was more main lines, and so we don't have this culture really of doing that. And so we have to really
Yeah.
equip, and we have to not only adopt that attitude, but you know, we actually have to equip people and help them get there, help them sort through it. And it's sort of like, you know, what Jordan Peterson said. You know, you are morally obligated try to achieve great things in life. I mean, that to me, like that would be like, oh, that's pride. You can't have it. Any sort of
Right.
attempt to be excellent is like denigrated
Uh-huh.
in some respects. And so, um, you know, that's kind of what I would say. We got to be, you know, when the sun is shining on Christianity, and you know, you're getting rewards for sitting and hanging out in the pews. You know, maybe you can kind of mail it in a little bit. You certainly can't do that today.
Hmm. Hmm. I wonder sometimes if when you look at where evangelicals send their best and their brightest and focus their most elite, I guess, maybe their best intellectual effort, doesn't it seem like that's going into the study of theology and maybe philosophy? But it seems to me like whenever I hear these criticisms, like I've heard you make these remarks before, and I completely agree that in terms of the broader culture, evangelicals simply are not known for making really impactful intellectual contributions. And yet, I study a lot of theology, I read a lot of commentaries and that sort of thing. And there's some really, really good stuff. You think about someone who's a mentor to me back in seminary, D.A. Carson, an absolutely brilliant mind. And who knows if he had taken that intellect somewhere else, he had applied it somewhere else. Maybe he would have been known as an intellectual elite in the broader society, but he focused instead on theology, biblical theology. And so is that the case? Is it just that we evangelicals are sending and expending our best intellectual effort on the study of theology and biblical studies, and that's why it's not making an impact?
I think the typical evangelical does not think about going into positions that have cultural influence they tend to go into positions that make money. Like, yeah, I think, a
Okay.
conservative, so a conservative who goes to an elite law school probably goes to work at a big law firm and does M&A law or something like that, makes a bunch
What
of
is
money,
M&A law?
mergers and acquisitions.
Okay.
So you're advising, you're doing all the legal work on mergers, acquisitions, or something like that. Or maybe you're doing litigation, maybe you're doing like pharmaceutical liability claims or something like that. You got whatever's going on and you're making a bunch of money and you're focused on that. You're not focused on the acquisition of cultural power. You're not focused on, becoming a college professor or something like that, like that research. I think a lot of our top talent goes into, candidly, the money-making business.
Okay.
And we've actually got tons and tons of evangelical money. Evangelicals are extremely wealthy people in America. There's a lot of like billionaires and things of that nature. And, unfortunately, our money is not being deployed all that well. I think often, a lot of times, because we don't have the sophistication about how to influence culture with it, in a way that, other people do. So I think that there's this sort of pursuit of maybe making money is too crass, but it's more traditional career orientation.
Okay.
Yeah, go be a consultant at Accenture like me. Help companies do technology, and that's where our talent is being deployed into things like that, more so than into the arts or college professors or journalism or things of that nature. And again, the people who tend to go into those fields, a lot of them, if they do go into it, it's because you actually like the values that are already there, less so than because you hope to change things. And to be fair, like there are barriers to more conservative people becoming, college professors today. Like becoming a tenured professor is, there are a lot of barriers to entry on that. At the same time, you don't, look at it this way. A lot of people who go to Harvard Law School, who are on the left, would love to go work or spend some time at an organization like the Natural Resources Defense Council or some public interest law group. I think very few, there are some, much fewer the minority of the people at Harvard Law School are conservatives. And of the ones who do go to Harvard Law School, most of them are probably going into big law practice. They're not going into the nonprofit sector or the political sector. So I got a friend. He got a Harvard Law School degree. He was a consultant. I think he was with Bain and Company. He got a Harvard Law School degree. He never practiced law. Instead, he became the domestic policy advisor to Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. And getting the law degree was basically his way to go into public policy. And so, he he is conservative, but like that's just a different mentality that you just don't have.
Yeah. As we bring this to a close, what would you say is the most important, or maybe even just one really important step that our listener can take if they want to increase their influence in a world that's increasingly hostile to Christianity? So we want to make a difference. What's a step that the average listener listening to this can take?
Well, what I would say is start with the basics, which is to say, become the person who is worthy of having influence in the world. And I think one of the ways to look at that is to look at the qualifications to be an elder in the church and to say, am I someone that you would appoint to be an elder in the church? And I think about that with regards to myself. I don't aspire to be an elder. I'm not looking to be in church leadership, but can I achieve the character that I have? Am I doing, like at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, the person who builds their house on the rock is a person who hears my words and does them. Am I doing it? Am I living out what's in the Bible? Am I serious about my faith, praying, etc.? That is like preconditional, I think, to influence, is to become the person who is worthy of having influence. And I think the unfortunate reality is most of us have a lot of work to do on that point.
That's a good point. So if people want to listen to more of your stuff, read your stuff, what's the best place for them to go?
Absolutely go to aaronrenn.com and sign up. AARONRENN.com. Sign up for my free newsletters, podcasts are all right there. It'll get you in on everything. And of course, buy the book, Life in the Negative World.
Absolutely. Yep. I highly recommend this book. It was very impactful for me. Aaron, thanks for writing it and thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, my guest today has been Aaron Renn. I, again, highly recommend his book. If you haven't read it yet, check it out. It's brand new. And so this is really cutting edge stuff. A lot of it's very research based. And I was telling Aaron before we started recording that at times it was even devotional. He talks about how important it is to center yourself on Christ first as the first step in pursuing life in the negative world. And you know what? That is why we launched the Hammer and Anvil Society. The Hammer and Anvil Society is the answer to the problem of feeling like a Lone Ranger Christian, like you don't really know where to start. The Hammer and Anvil Society is a community that answers the question, what would it look like for Christian men to accept God's call to follow Christ with their families with courageous ownership and spirit-filled joy? The Hammer and Anvil Society is a fraternity of brothers that are seizing the opportunity to learn how to clearly, confidently, and convincingly articulate our Christian beliefs and why we believe them. The Hammer and Anvil Society is a movement of men who are not satisfied with leaving the spiritual development of their children in the hands of others, but who are seeking to take up the mantle of spiritual and theological leader in their homes, as commanded by Ephesians 6:4 and so many other passages. This is the society for Christian men who want to study the philosophy of Christianity, lead consistent family worship times in their homes, faithfully raise their children in the truth, and capably provide their wives with godly leadership and spiritual direction. We are committed to building a legacy in the Christian worldview in our households, churches, workplaces, and local areas. The Hammer and Anvil Society is the brotherhood of men who refuse to miss out on God's calling on their lives. You can learn more about the Hammer and Anvil Society by going to www.thethink.institute/society. thethink.institute/society. Thank you for listening. And we've got some nice comments that came in. Someone said that they really enjoyed the podcast. Someone else added the book to Goodreads. That's wonderful. And then we even got a comment from someone who said that they were a dental hygienist and actually experienced an ethical dilemma, but refused to do the procedures and told patients if something was unnecessary. So that is really, really encouraging to hear that kind of thing, because as Aaron said, we do need to be living with integrity and pursuing excellence. And that's all part of how we make an impact here in the negative world. Well, thank you for listening and watching this episode of the Worldview Legacy Podcast. My name is Joel Sedekase. I am the executive director of the Think Institute. We are a Christian teaching and outreach organization seeking to equip Christian men to build a legacy where they, their wives, and their children can confidently articulate the answers to the questions that the world is asking and build a legacy for their family, pass on the faith to the younger generation. And we are based by God's grace. This is Worldview Legacy, the podcast from the Think Institute that helps Christian men become the worldview leaders their families and churches need.